Hello and welcome to this month's ELL strategy video. As you probably remember, last month's ELL strategy was around intentional student interaction. Before we begin on this month's strategy, I'd like to do a quick review around why purposeful student interaction in our classrooms is so important, especially for ELL students, but really for all students. We know that input, whether it be a teacher lecture, a computer program, or a text, leads to content knowledge for students. Comprehensible input leads to content knowledge for more students, including our ELL students and low academic proficiency students. Comprehensible input plus student interaction leads to expanded content knowledge for more students, since they're able to build off each other's ideas. And finally, comprehensible input plus purposeful student interaction leads to expanded content knowledge for more students, plus growth in academic language proficiency. We will circle back around to this idea later in this video. This month, I would like to focus on language objectives. This month's video is just going to be part 1 since this topic is so important and extensive. We will move deeper into language objectives in next month's video. But for now, since language objectives may be new to some of you, I'd like to begin with some clarification. Our work as teachers is guided by the Common Core State Standards and by our knowledge of students, which is obtained through anecdotal evidence and through data. First, let's discuss how standards and objectives relate. The Common Core State Standards give us broad learning goals, many of which could be applied in a variety of content areas. For example, this standard, which is a 6th grade informational writing standard, it's Standard 2, Substandard B, says, develop the topic with relevant facts, definitions, concrete details, quotations, or other information and examples. This standard could be applied in writing, in social studies, reading, or any variety of subject areas. Objectives are determined at the unit or lesson level and describe specific measurable knowledge or skills that the students will have as a result of instruction. Objectives will look different depending on the content area or lesson in which they are applied. For example, 6th grade students who are writing a short informational piece about a science topic might have objectives that look like this. Take a moment to read them. You might notice that the objectives get progressively difficult, with students first being asked just to recognize relevant facts and key quotations in a mentor text, then to identify facts and quotations in an informational text that relates to their own topic, and finally to incorporate those facts and quotations into a piece of writing. If this standard was being applied in reading or social studies, the objectives would look slightly different, of course. Our Readers and Writers Workshop units also use multiple lessons, each with different objectives to cover the same standard. For example, in this 6th grade unit on research-based information writing, some aspect of Anchor Standard 2, Write Informative Explanatory Texts, is covered in every lesson, of course. Standard 2B, the standard that we looked at on the previous slide, is covered specifically in session 7, 9, and 13. If we look at the mini lessons from those same sessions, we can see the variety of objectives that these lessons cover. So lesson 7 is on constructing text with solid bricks of information. Lesson 9, writing with detail, and you can bet some of those details are going to be the key quotes and facts that were gathered. And then finally, mini lesson 13 has an objective around using quotes. We've been talking about content objectives, but now I want to talk about the difference between content and language objectives. A simple way to explain the difference would be to say content objectives focus on the what of student learning, and language objectives focus on how that learning happens and is demonstrated. Language objectives are important because in addition to the subject area content that students are learning, Language is naturally embedded in every lesson or assignment in which students engage. Sometimes we ask students to use receptive language, whether that be making sense of the content area vocabulary in a social studies text or understanding the structure of a classmate's argument as she expresses her opinion. Other times, students are required to use expressive language, which might mean arguing an opposite point of view from the classmate he just listened to, or writing a poem. Most of the time, the assignments we give students are a mix of receptive and expressive language demands. Here are some sample language tasks that you might find in a classroom. Take a minute to think of a typical academic task in your classroom and think about where it would fit in this Venn diagram. Once we think about what the language demands are for a particular lesson, we know how to scaffold for them. Let's look at a new standard for an example. This is Common Core Math Standard for Grade 2, the Geometry Unit, Substandard A1, and it reads, recognize and draw shapes having specified attributes such as a given number of angles or a given number of equal faces. Identify triangles, quadrilaterals, pentagons, hexagons, and cubes. Over the course of a unit, one content objective that might come from this standard is students will be able to sort a variety of shapes into the categories of triangles, quadrilaterals, pentagons, or hexagons based on the number of angles and sides each shape has. This is what we want students to learn. But exactly how do we want them to demonstrate their reasoning? This is where the language objective comes in. There are so many different types of language aspects that students must learn to become fluent English speakers. We typically think of vocabulary, but grammar and the different types of language required for, say, a compare and contrast question versus a summarizing task are all important. Take a minute to think about which of these language tasks apply to our content objective, which is asking students to sort shapes based on their attributes. For this particular task, students must understand the key vocabulary, angle and side, which will help them to categorize the shapes. They must also understand which is the relevant definition of side in this case, since that word has multiple meanings. Eventually, they'll need to know how to use the language of categorization to explain their reasoning. You may have identified other language demands as well. A language objective for this task might sound like this. With a partner, students will be able to explain their reasoning for sorting each shape into the selected category using the key vocabulary, angle, and side in a complete sentence. Again, now that I have identified the language demands, I can plan in some scaffolding for my lower proficiency students. For this particular task, you could use some of the strategies featured in last month's video, for example, providing a sentence frame like this one at the bottom of the sorting map. Students may choose to use these sentence frames or may feel comfortable formulating their own reasons. Or you could include a graphic at the top of the sorting sheet reminding students of the definitions of the key vocabulary. You could purposefully pair students so that the lower proficiency student could hear a higher proficiency model before giving his reasoning. This takes us back to where we started. Giving a task that helps students practice and apply your comprehensible input is a good place to start and leads to expanded content knowledge for more students. But adding in purposeful opportunity for student interaction means that students are gaining a double benefit. Taking a few minutes to identify the language demands embedded in your lesson, defining through a language objective what it is that you want students to do, and adding scaffolding to make sure that all students can meet the demands of the lesson will go a long way in building not only content knowledge, but fluency in academic language, which ultimately all students need to succeed in college, career, and beyond. This month, I would love to help you develop language objectives and scaffolding to help the students meet those objectives. In fact, if you bring me a week's worth of language and content objectives in any subject area, or work with me to develop them, I will put together all of the scaffolding that will help your students achieve those objectives. That might mean searching for and cutting out relevant images to support your lesson, finding a similar lower level text that will allow your lower proficiency students to access a topic, or simply writing out sentence stems to help your students begin their academic discussion. Let me know how I can help, and thank you for watching.